तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय
पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे, मन में तेरा आदर मान और मोहब्बत सदा रहे। पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे।
तू है अपना भविष्य विधाता, पंख बिना परवान सिखाता, जीवन पुस्तक रोज पढ़ाकर सही गलत की समझ बढ़ाता।
जीवन पुस्तक रोज पढ़ाकर सही गलत की समझ बढ़ाता।
तेरी जय गौ शंख बजाए,
रोशन तारे बन जाए,
बखरी तेरी शोहरत सदा सदा रहे।
विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे। पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे।
तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय।
या कुंडेनु तुषार हार धवला, या शुभ्रवस्त्रावृता, या वीणावर दंड मंडित करा, या श्वेत पद्मासना, या ब्रह्माच्युत शंकरा प्रभृतिभिः देवै सदा वन्दिता, सा मां पातु सरस्वती भगवती निःशेषजाड्यापहा। शुक्लां ब्रह्म विचार सार परमा, आद्यां जगद्व्यापिनीं, वीणा पुस्तकधारिणीम् अभयदाम्, जाड्यान्धकारापहम्। हस्ते स्वाटिकमल्लिकां विदधतीं, पद्मासने संस्थितां, वन्दे तं परमेश्वरीं भगवतीम् बुद्धिप्रदां शारदाम् बुद्धिप्रदां शारदाम्. Thank you.
Studies at the City College of New York. He is the founding president of American Philosophical Practitioners Association and founding editor of its journal, Philosophical Practice. It's a delight to know that Europe's Journal of Psychology pronounces him as a Renaissance man, and New York Times Weekend magazine declares him to be the world's greatest marketer of philosophical counseling. His CV reveals his research interests in interdisciplinary areas. He has taught different courses on applied ethics, bioethics, Buddhism, Chinese philosophy, critical thinking, decision-making theory, artificial intelligence, philosophy of science too. Among his works, the pioneer ones are On Human Conflict, The Philosophical Foundations of War and Peace, The Inner Philosopher, Conversations on Philosophies, Transformation, Power, and numerous book chapters to his credit. And Professor Marinoff, we welcome you and wish to know your viewpoint on the nature and concerns of philosophical counseling. As per varied interests you carry, we also wish you to enunciate, if there are any, the Indian and Buddhist linkages you might have discovered while practicing philosophical counseling. I would also request you to throw some light in the context of your findings as to what philosophical counseling cannot do. With these words, I once again welcome you to this platform, Elenchus. Thank you so much for coming.
Namaste, and welcome to you all as well. And thank you so much. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you, Professor Sharma, Professor Devarakonda, your esteemed colleagues, and to all the students who may be joining us today. I'm going to try to answer the very good questions that you've addressed in your email and just momentarily. And it to be a bit of a challenge to do all of this in about 50 minutes. So I'm going to try at least to give you a kind of big picture that will locate some of your questions and endeavor to give some answers to them. And then I hope we'll have some time after that, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes or so, to have more dialogue. All right, so that would be our plan. The first thing I should like to do is actually to share. I have a few slides to share with you, which will help provide a picture for these responses. I'm going to endeavor to share the first one now. And it's really a map, if you like, a kind of conceptual map of what is philosophical counseling. I think that's a very good place for us to begin. And so allow me to share this slide with you. I'm assuming you can all see this, so I will speak to it very briefly. Philosophical counseling is, and there are many terms, and not every country is using the same terms, so it's a little bit confusing. I mean, language is quite elastic, so we will be somewhat elastic with our terminology. But as far as APA understands it, the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, we regard philosophical practice as a kind of umbrella term, which entails several areas of practice. And client counseling is probably the one that's received the most publicity. So philosophical counseling comes from a merger of these two terms, philosophical practice and client counseling. And this is mostly one-on-one work, where a philosopher is dialoguing with usually one client, occasionally with a married couple, but mostly it's one-on-one counseling. Another mode of practice is group facilitation, in which the practitioner is actually conducting a dialogue in a group setting, and this can be both formal or informal. On the informal side, you may have heard of the Café Philo, founded by the French philosopher, the late French philosopher Marc Sauté, a former professor at Sorbonne, who opened a cafe and began to do philosophy with the public. And that was in an informal space and in an informal way. We have more formal methods as well. Most beautifully, I think, from Germany, the method of Nelsonian Socratic dialogue. But in any case, that is a way of working with groups. Another mode is organizational consulting, in which philosophers can indeed work, deploy their skill sets within a variety of corporations, governmental ministries, or indeed other kinds of organizations, be they public or private sector. And that kind of mode entails not only a familiarity with the other two, one will have to do a certain amount of counseling, a certain amount of facilitation, but there are also more goal-driven aspects to practicing within an organization, and it's a little bit more challenging in some respects. And nonetheless, it's a very important area of practice, and one in which I also have some experience. The fourth mode, we could say, would be educational programs. And this entails such movements as Philosophy for Children, or P4C, which is really hived off from philosophical practice, but it's become an extremely successful movement worldwide. Children are very philosophical, very inquiring, very awestruck by their natures, and so they make great little inquirers, and it's a good thing, I think, and a necessary thing in their preparation, their socialization, that they should be exposed to philosophical inquiry in an age-appropriate way. So Philosophy for Children has made great strides in many countries, and there are associations which specialize in that. But it also feeds back what I'm calling educational programs, obviously, as those blue arrows on the bottom indicate, also feed back to practice, because we train and educate philosophers in order to become counselors, facilitators, and consultants. So part of the education under the aegis of philosophical practice is itself philosophical practice, and is also a question of training the next generation of practitioners, which my colleagues and I have been doing now for more than 20 years. So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview. And if you would like to see some of the literature, there is literature on both the popular and the scholarly side, and those links below. We'll just give you an example. APA's bookstore has many varied books on all of these topics by some of our own practitioner members, and indeed our journal, which, as you were kind to say, I edit, publishes peer-reviewed articles on all of these issues and all of these topics as well. So those are two links which would give a gateway into these resources. All right, so that's a sort of conceptual map of where philosophical practice is located. Now I want to turn to your questions. So we're going to focus on counseling today. As you see, it's already a large field and a growing field, as you're well aware. So this morning, we're going to focus on the counseling, which has received perhaps most of the publicity for a variety of reasons that I will not go into today. And so you ask in the first instance, philosophical counseling is an emerging area. I'm quoting these excellent questions you sent me, or the convener sent me. Philosophical counseling is an emerging area and is still gripped with confusing issues such as whether the business of philosophy is to conceptually clarify or indeed to counsel. Although the average Indian mind is aware of the situation whereby Arjuna is being counseled by Krishna, the most, and this is very philosophical, of course, Bhagavan of Indian philosophy, and it is a philosophical counseling session, if you like. Indeed, Lord Sri Krishna is counseling Arjuna on the way, on the right way to act, and so forth. So we have unaddressed issues, and so you say it would be helpful if we can rope them in. Yes. So let me go to the second slide because I would like to perhaps correct a misconception about the antiquity of this practice. I think that philosophical practice is not an emerging area. Philosophical counseling is actually not new at all. It dates back to antiquity, and I think in every generation there have been philosophical counselors. So please allow me now to share the screen again, and I will attempt to show you just a couple of quotations that will illustrate the antiquity of this application of philosophy. And here they are. Ancient Greece, vain is the word of the philosopher that does not heal any suffering of man. Epicurus, so the Epicureans were not devoted exclusively to introspection. They saw philosophy as a way of healing. Seneca, ancient Rome, the great Roman Stoic, would you really know what philosophy offers to humanity? Philosophy offers counsel. Well, here you have it from one of his letters from a Stoic. I fast forward now to the 19th century and the great American idealist, the transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau's mentor. And he says what lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies within us. And I think part of the idea of philosophical counseling is, at least in my view, and that's shared by many of my colleagues, is to mobilize the inner resources of the human being. And this, in a way, puts us on the path of Indian philosophy and on the path of Buddhism, the heterodox school, which has gone around the world. I think, historically, Buddhism may be your greatest export. And I'll return to this at the end of the talk. But in a very modest way, if we're attempting to mobilize what is innate within us, potentialities and possibilities that lie within us, and if philosophy is a vehicle for helping us to do that, then in a very modest way, it surely will be reminiscent to Indians of the self-realization of Atman as Brahman, and will be recognizable to Buddhists as the awakening of Buddha nature. And indeed, that comparison has been made by a great Buddhist leader to whom I'll return toward the end. And finally, into the 20th century, the great American pragmatist John Dewey said that philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men. So the pragmatists, at least Dewey, was well aware of this and wished to divert philosophy back to what he deemed to be its original course, not strictly speaking an introspective discipline interested in its own inherent problems, logical, epistemological, and ethical, insofar as theory leads us, but also to turn them back to humanity at large and deploy them in a way which addresses the problems that people have. Okay, so that should be a bit of evidence, anecdotal, at least, that illustrates that I think this is an ancient way of philosophizing, and perhaps the novelty lies in the fact that it had lain dormant for some time before it began to be revived by my colleagues and I in the late 20th century. Now to your very important question, what philosophical counseling cannot do? And, we can't. There are so many things that we can't do. It may be more beneficial to focus on what we can do. So I'll answer your question by taking, the inverse, and let's look at this smaller universe, the smaller set of things that philosophical counseling can do. But I can tell you off the bat that this is what I'm going to say to you is, and I'm going to show you a scope of practice that in 5 short phrases summarizes what we think we can do, what our practice indicates we can do. What we can't do should be clear from the outset. We can't treat mental illness. There are, we believe, not all of us. I mean, philosophers disagree on everything at the end of the day. So, but most of us in APA certainly agree that there are forms of mental illness, however ill-defined and however ill understood, neuroscience, in fairness, is a science in its infancy. And so the brain is the least well understood of all of our organs. So what is really at the bottom of mental illness causally is not that well explicated. Nonetheless, it seems clear behaviorally that there are people who need medication, who need psychiatric help in order to be minimally functional. And I think it would be a mistake, and indeed it would be harmful to try to use philosophy alone to help such people. There are some philosophers who believe that every illness can be treated philosophically. I disagree. Respectfully disagree, and I think it would be unprofessional and unethical to attempt to treat certain forms of mental illness with philosophical counseling. That said, we temper that view with the recognition that in the last 100 years or so, particularly since the end of World War II in the West, psychology has become greatly empowered, vastly empowered by governments, and the furtherance of psychology and psychotherapy has attained a kind of overreaching of its possibilities. There has been a medicalization of the human being, and indeed a pathologization of the human being that has taken place owing partly to the colonization of psychotherapy, whether delivered by licensed psychologists or by psychiatrists. And that industry has been colonized by big pharma, and their interest mainly is selling medication. Their interest is not making people well. They're interested in making them consumers of medications. And I'm not against good science either. I'm merely saying that there's a lot of gratuitous diagnosis and drugging going on in the West. It's a huge industry. We're drugging school children on a massive scale with Ritalin instead of imposing traditional discipline on them. And there's been far too much reliance on medication and diagnosis. Americans in particular are psychologized from cradle to grave. So there has been no emphasis on philosophy, no emphasis on these internal resources which are dormant, be they powers of will or powers of mind, and a great deal of emphasis on regarding the human being as a fundamentally sick animal. And this, I think, does a great injustice to humanity as a whole and to our humanness. So we have been in the business of reclaiming some of that turf. And a lot of the most successful psychological interventions turn out to be derived from philosophical schools of thought. The cognitive schools of psychotherapy, which all do very well, are all grounded in philosophy, be they the Stoic schools or indeed the existentialist schools, to name but two. And so why not philosophers doing this? I mean, these schools are inherently philosophical. We understand them, I dare say, better than many psychologists who merely popularize them. And the latest manifestation of this sort of dilution and popularization of philosophy has happened with mindfulness. And I'm sure you're aware that we call it McMindfulness. They've extracted the seventh factor from the Eightfold Path. They've diluted it, and it's been bottled and sold as if it were an invention of psychologists, which clearly it is not. And it's a much richer practice when located, or rather situated in its original context, as a factor, and of course a very important one, in the Eightfold Way. So I think that psychology does a great service. There are people who also can benefit from psychotherapy, and perhaps more than from philosophy, if they're particularly distressed emotionally. Philosophy is a rational discipline. We work best with people who are rational and functional. People who are under severe emotional distress probably are better off, initially at least, with psychology. Psychiatrists are no longer being trained to dialogue. They're really being trained only to in pharmacology. It's called molecular psychiatry. There's no more talk therapy going on of the kind that Freud engaged in early on in psychoanalysis and so forth. So psychiatry has become a branch of medicine mostly focused on the molecular level. So who's going to talk to people? Well, that would leave a lot of potential for philosophers. All right. So let me now share a slide that delineates our scope of practice. That is the one that APPA recommends. And I'll illustrate that to you here. This scope of practice was initially developed for research at the City College of New York, and it's been cloned at least 5 public universities in the United States, so that any philosopher with a tenurable position or tenured position is eligible to apply to do this as part of their legitimate research. So this is what we can do, Professor Sharma, not what we can't do. But what we can do is the following. Philosophical counseling is intended for clients who are rational, functional, and not mentally ill. Yes, I emphasize that again. But who can benefit from philosophical assistance in resolving or managing problems associated with normal life experience. This is a very important phrase, and I'll explain it in a moment. Normal life experience. In America, as you may be aware, we live in an incredibly litigious society, and there are constantly armies of lawyers seeking to sue people to recover damages for various harms, be they real or imagined. There's a huge industry of this. So basically, what insurance companies are worried about is exposure and liability, which could end up in huge financial penalties against them in court. So any activity that one wishes to undertake in a helping way, even if it's beneficial, needs to be insured. If you're a doctor who's performing surgery in New York City, your annual insurance premiums are going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars just to protect you from legal liability. If you're a dentist, similarly, you'll be paying a fortune. Even if you're talking to people, they could turn around and sue you. So you have to have professional liability insurance. And of course, that covers, that's a lower risk, so it's a lower premium. Philosophical counseling, when it was approved as by the Institutional Review Board at my college, which operates under federal government mandates, decided, after evaluating our proposal, that philosophical counseling lay in the lowest possible risk category. There is no such thing in the insurance business or the actuarial tables as no risk. Getting up in the morning entails some minimal risk. Eating breakfast entails some minimal risk, walking across the street and so forth. But they call this the lowest possible risk category, any risk associated with normal life experience. And philosophy has been actually categorized as being in that lowest possible risk. So no foreseeable harms can come to people from talking to philosophers. And at the beginning, when we made headlines for doing this in the US and worldwide, there was a great hue and cry from many, not all, many psychologists and many psychiatrists belong to APA and practice philosophy themselves in tandem with what else they do. But there was a hue and cry from the people interested in protecting the turf and the enormous amounts of the rivers of money that flow through the healthcare system. So they were immediately trying to panic people and tell them, oh, if you talk to a philosopher, you may commit suicide. There was this great fear they tried to stir up. I must tell you, there have been philosophical practitioners, to my knowledge, in now practicing for 40 years and more, and more recently with APA for the last 20 years and more. And there has never been a single case that I'm aware of a client who committed suicide after talking to a philosopher. So that claim is absolutely unsubstantiable. It's not dangerous to speak to philosophers. If it were, we wouldn't be allowed to teach philosophy in the university, surely. Now, what we have to say may at times make students think twice or may in fact shake up their belief systems. What Socrates called the examined life is if you lead that kind of life, you may indeed have to make some modifications to what you believe, but that's surely a process of growth, not of harm. So what we deal with are primarily 5 categories of problems that people present. Firstly, issues of private morality or professional ethics, obviously philosophical. Second, meanings of value, issues of meaning, value, or purpose. Now, psychologists do some work in those areas too, and so for that matter, do pastoral or religious counselors. There are different answers that could be given to those questions, but philosophers obviously have a big stake in this. Thirdly, issues of personal or professional fulfillment. Going back to Aristotle, certainly in the West, in his concept of eudaimonia as fulfillment, virtue ethics has a great deal to say in that area, and so does existentialism in a modern context, to name but 2 schools. Issues of undetermined or inconsistent belief systems. It's very important because people often have conflicting beliefs, and this translates psychologically into what used to be called cognitive dissonance, but is actually existential dissonance. And we can certainly help to disentangle inconsistent beliefs. Issues requiring any philosophical interpretation of changing circumstances, and that's a very large area of problems that we happily deal with and effectively deal with. So I hope that gives you a bit of insight into what we can do. And those, if a client comes with such a problem during an initial consultation, we will see, well, if what the client is presenting fits into this scope of practice, then we feel fairly confident that it's something that indeed can be handled philosophically. If what the client presents does not clearly fit into that scope, then we recommend, and I do, refer clients for alternative help, be it to a doctor, be it to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, or some avenue of appropriate help. And this is, I think, a professional way to proceed. And it's a way that's well established. And as well, we get referrals. So I've had clients referred to me by doctors, by psychologists, by psychiatrists who understand that what they're presenting is philosophical and indeed might be best addressed by a philosopher. So I hope that should provide, at least in a very summary form, an answer to the question of what we think we can do and what for the last 20 or 30 years we've been doing fairly successfully. How many referrals do I make? My empirical case studies inform me that about 1 in 20 clients is not suitable for my practice. So 5% of people who see me are referred because what they're presenting does not fit my scope. But that means that 95% of the people who come to me are suitable for my practice. So I hope that's of some help to you. The next question that you ask, and it's again a very important question, can in any way conceptual clarification or analysis be related to counseling per se? I'm going to show you one more slide which has some text on it that should hopefully directly answer this question for you. So let me just put that up on the screen. And what the text comes from is the preamble to APA's Code of Professional Ethics, which all the practitioners we certify are agreeing to practice under the auspices of that code. All professions have codes, and they're not graven in stone, they're living documents. But this one has been approved and tried and worked quite well. I'm not going into the code itself, this is only the preamble, but it should answer your question about conceptual clarification. So that's not the only thing that we do when we counsel people. While individual philosophical practitioners may differ in method and theoretical orientation, for example, analytic or existential phenomenological, and we welcome all schools. We don't, it's not up to us. We're very inclusive, and anyone with an MA or a PhD in philosophy can be certified, trained and certified by APA, whether you come from the analytic tradition or indeed the continental tradition or an Asian tradition. That's all fine for us because all philosophy in principle can be useful. So while we may differ in method and theoretical orientation, which we do very greatly, we all do some things in common. We facilitate such activities in counseling and in our other modalities as, one, the examination of clients' arguments and justifications, just as we would do in our own literature. Two, the clarification, analysis, and definition of important terms and concepts. This is something people, are very muddled about. They want to understand what it means to be autonomous, or they want to understand what it means to be able to exercise certain kinds of civil liberties, and what are the permissible extents to which we can, in a civil society, for example, protest or object to a law or a policy. And that's partly the kind of clarification that we do. Analysis and definitions of important terms and concepts, both historically and philosophically, and in terms of their applicability to contemporary life. Thirdly, the exposure and examination of underlying assumptions and logical implications. So we don't tell clients what to do, but we indeed help them to examine the implications of possible choices. And that is part of our work. Fourthly, the exposure of conflicts and inconsistencies. Again, all these things, if I had more time, I could support with case studies to illustrate precisely how this plays out in the consultation. Fifthly, the exploration of traditional philosophical theories and their significance for clients' issues. This is a big thing for us because, many clients, and you may have discovered this in teaching, but we find that many clients reinvent for themselves significant fragments of schools of philosophy or traditions of philosophy to which they've had no formal exposure. And suddenly they come out with something, and we can help to locate them on the map, if you like, a philosophical inquiry by saying, you sound like a Platonist, or you sound like an Aristotelian, or you sound like an existentialist. And this gives them an identity which they actually didn't know that they had. And it's actually a wonderful thing. They're able suddenly to identify their own way of thinking with a school of whose existence they really had no inkling. And then they may ask to read more deeply. Very often they want readings. We call this bibliotherapy. It's very effective. It grounds them a little more deeply in the things that they've begun to invent or reinvent. So this is very, very useful. It's really what we do in a classroom, except in a classroom we choose the curriculum. In a counseling session, the client chooses the curriculum. And all other related activities that have historically been identified as philosophical. This is to reclaim some turf from other helping disciplines which have perhaps at times failed to recognize certain problems that are philosophical and not, for example, psychological or psychiatric. So we want to reclaim that turf, and we do. And that is, I hope, helpful to you to show that philosophical counseling is much more than clarifying terms and concepts, although that is certainly a part of what we do. I just want to say to you that this is all more tractable, I think, and more comprehensible when grounded in case studies. When you see, read, how does it unfold in the counseling room, then this sort of theory or these abstract ways of working become much more grounded in experience. So I could recommend for the students who are joining us today, and certainly for the professors as well, the popular literature, including my books, but not restricted to my books. The popular literature gives lots of case studies on how we actually work with clients. Plato, Not Prozac, I guess, is one of the better known books. That was published in 1999. It's been translated into more than 25 languages, and it's full of case studies. And it's really for the consumer. It's really to allow people a window onto what happens in a philosophical counseling session. And they relate very deeply to this. We have problems of all kinds being dealt with by more than 60 philosophers are used in that book. The sequel, which is called Therapy for the Sane, incorporates more than 100 philosophers and also works from literature, which may be very philosophical and helpful to people thematically. So these popular books are illustrative of how cases work. On the textbook side, as some of you know, I know Bala knows, the textbook that I wrote in 2001 is called Philosophical Practice, and that's more of a theoretical exposition of what we think we're doing, and also a contrast with psychology, psychiatry, and spiritual counseling. So that's more of a textbook for philosophers. But I think that reading, and also, of course, APA's journal, which publishes all kinds of scholarly papers, peer-reviewed papers by practitioners worldwide, is, I think, a great resource. We've been publishing 3 issues per year since 2005, and that is searchable on APA's website. So you'll be able to find, I think, a very nice storehouse of professional literature in that form. And so this will gradually allow you to explore different avenues of practice and different styles and different schools. Your next question, and I think there are really well, there's 2 more questions to deal with, and I'll try to do so expeditiously. Firstly, you ask, and this is a wonderful question. I love this. I'm so happy that you asked, and I'll read it. All texts are full of guidelines, and we at Heart know what is to be done or what is doable and what is not. And if so, then why do we seek counseling? What do words do? Motivate us? The written word and the spoken words have different impact? I think this is partly rhetorical. I think you know they do. And perhaps you would just want me to briefly explain why I think they do. Of course they do. And I'll give you 3 quick reasons. And by the way, if you know in your heart what is to be done or what is doable, then you're fortunate. I think many people actually need a little bit of help to get in touch with what I call the inner philosopher. That inner philosopher may be dormant or maybe hibernating. So this is what philosophical counselors can also do. And I think in one way or another, we all do. We help to awaken the inner philosopher of our client. And that's when our client becomes independent. When the client's inner philosopher is awakened, then that philosopher indeed can guide the client in the proper pathway. And this is a difference between philosophy and psychotherapy. Psychotherapy in principle never ends. Because the longer you live, the more past you have and the more there is to excavate. Psychoanalysis is no end to it, no end to it. And psychotherapy similarly could have no end to it. Philosophical counseling could have an end. And to me, it's the clients will always say the most important words. In my experience, I'm doing this almost 30 years. And it's always the client who says something that's the most important and will signal that the inner philosopher is awake, and therefore the client is fine to go on. So the three ways in which the spoken word differs from the written word, I think, are as follows. Way number one, if we are reading a dialogue, we are spectators of the dialogue. If you're reading Bhagavad Gita, you're spectating on the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna. If you're reading Plato's dialogues, if you're reading the Analects of Confucius, all these iconic works from the ancient world in different cultures are dialogues, interestingly, but when we study them as necessarily as spectators. But when you're in a dialogue, you're a participant. And that makes a world of difference. So when you're having a dialogue with somebody, you're not spectating on a dialogue, you are actually participating in a live dialogue. And so I think that makes a significant difference. That's the first difference. The second one is that most philosophical texts are not self-interpreting. You know, mathematical texts may well be. I remember a very brilliant friend of mine in mathematics as a student who never went to class because he took the mathematics book and he took a piece of chalk and he proved everything in the blackboard, and he understood the book without any lectures because the mathematics and logic are largely self-interpreting. If you understand the theorem, you don't need the professor to teach it to you. But philosophy is not self-interpreting in this way. In fact, it lends itself to many interpretations. So it's always useful, it's always fruitful to have a dialogue about possible interpretations. And similarly, what happens in our clients' lives and the circumstances they encounter and their responses to those circumstances are also amenable to varying interpretations. And so the usefulness of dialogue then is hermeneutic and maieutic. It allows the clients to make a helpful rather than a harmful interpretation of what they're experiencing, and find a better way forward rather than a worse way forward. And that's a benefit, of, again, of spoken dialogue. And thirdly, and most briefly, this is your own tradition. Do we read mantras or do we speak mantras? If we're doing mantra yoga, it seems to me the mantra is chanted, the mantra is recited as you began this session with, I believe, a mantra. Well, there's a reason for reciting them orally and not just reading them silently. And you know better than I why that is the case. So mantra yoga must be spoken to be most effective. So there's a power of the word which the text somehow does not have, even though the text endures across centuries and our words die with us, except cyberspace. But the text endures, but there's a power of the word above that. Okay, and that's a short, let's throw three perhaps short answers. And then the last question, I transposed your first question to last, if I may, and that was about the importance of the middle path, and what I'm calling the middle way. So now I become a shameless author, and I'm 2 more minutes. I will share with you an answer to what I believe the importance of the middle path is, and that's the last slide that I want to share with you as well. So just allow me to do this. Some of you know already that I've recently re-released an older book, The Middle Way, which was first published in 2007, and the 2020 edition has just come out now. So I'll share that with you. That's the slide. The Middle Way applies the virtue ethics of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. Fortuitously, in Indo-European languages, they're the ABCs, yes, the ABCs of virtue ethics. To harmonize extremes that are tearing humanity apart: political, religious, economic, educational, social, sexual, every possible kind of extreme afflicts us. Extremism preempts human happiness. That's the thesis of each of these. I'm calling Buddha a philosopher for these purposes. Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius each lauded the virtues of the middle way. Each one did. And extremism preempts human happiness. The middle way promotes it. And the middle way is therefore an antidote to blind fanaticism and delusional radicalism alike. Whichever extreme one is afflicted with, it's usually not good. So that's brand new, updated, and it comes at a time when it's very, very sorely needed. Certainly, the world at large has always been afflicted with extremes, and if one, I suppose, takes refuge in Indian philosophy, my Indian friends often say, well, okay, Kali Yuga, Kali Yuga, okay, but even within that, there is still something we can do. And we're not entirely powerless, whether you're chanting Hare Krishna or whether you are in fact practicing some other kind of virtue ethics, that we are still not powerless to act, Kali Yuga or not. We can always live a better way rather than a worse way. And I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, I don't know what kind of reporting you're getting, but I now speak to you from outside of New York, about 50 miles north in the country. Fortunately, I'm surrounded by trees and deer and birds. I'm not surrounded by rioters yet, although after the election that could change. The riots may well indeed spread, and that is what some of the candidates are saying they should do. So this is, we are in a civil war. We've been in a civil war for decades, but it's spiking now, and we're in a phase which has become, I think, more ugly in many respects than in my living memory. So I felt impelled, as the COVID plague has basically derailed us all and destabilized economies. And I'm sorry that India is also now perhaps eclipsing us in number of cases. And I hope that that you'll find a way to all of us are struggling to work with this and walking this high wire, right? The middle way between exposure and economic function. Yes, that we need that middle way. It's a tightrope. Yes, if we go to one extreme and lock down, we can't function economically. If we go to the other extreme and do as we wish, then we'll spread the contagion. So talk about a middle way being necessary. And COVID has also destabilized, because it's destabilized economies, it's empowered extremists. The history of conflict is full of this. Whenever economies become destabilized, extremism rises. Extremists become empowered. When things are going well, no one pays attention to them. When things are going badly, they gain more traction. So that's an unfortunate thing in my view. All right, I'll leave it there. We've always needed the middle way, but in dire circumstances, we need it always more than ever. And I hope that these wisdom traditions, both of Aristotle and of Confucius and of Buddha most of all, because Buddha's the middle way between the middle, he's the middle way within the middle way. Aristotle errs on the side of the individual over the collective, and Confucius errs on the side of the collective over the individual. And Buddha, to me, is actually taking the best of both worlds and celebrating the importance of us, but impossible for us to be important, disconnected from everyone. So it's the middle way within the middle way. I'll leave it at that, and hope that this has been helpful and fruitful to you. And we'd be happy to entertain questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Wonderful, and I must say that you have, by the way of addressing questions, you have spoken your. You have been very informal in your talk. You have addressed questions that I wanted you to address, and not only this, you have also given a blueprint in which a framework in which you have been working. And thank you for bringing in the antiquity of the idea of philosophical counseling. Thank you for referring back to Epicurus' Vain is the world. It was very interesting to find out the historical references, because this strengthens the foundation pillar of philosophy as such, I would say. And not only this, by raking up, by saying neti neti, probably you have picked up that formula, Upanishadic formula, neti neti, what philosophical counseling cannot do. That was probably the best. It has worked best, I would say. By saying what it can't do, you have enunciated what it actually does for human beings. That was really nice. And not only this, and there are number of points that I've jotted down, and I would really appreciate if you can now take up questions. The most interesting thing, the last that you know, the culmination of your entire presentation is ABC formula that Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. I can understand that. This really makes sense. So our participants are eagerly waiting you to address their questions. And we'll be picking up 3 questions from YouTube first, and then probably we can switch over to our guests who have joined us. So the first question is, please feel free to address questions if you find that, yes, they are worth answering. Does philosophical counseling has a fixed purpose of valuing life over death, even if the person seeking counseling thinks end of life as a relief? Schopenhauer and Hegel have been sympathetic towards death. I mean,
yes, this is a really great question. And please understand something. Philosophy itself has different connotations in different countries and different cultures. Every country has philosophy, but every national identity filters in philosophical insights in a slightly different way, and also has its own indigenous and received traditions. So there are very different viewpoints toward, for example, rational suicide. We're talking about end of life, what the Greeks called euthanasia, a good death. Now, in the United States, I can speak more, I guess, expertly to where I am. I know the Dutch many years ago pioneered this. They introduced euthanasia as a legal practice. So people had to fulfill certain conditions. If people, unfortunately, had a terminal illness that was incurable, and they only had a short time to live, and they were suffering very greatly, as with breakthrough cancer pain, other kinds of pain, and they were living without dignity, being intubated in a hospital and being kept alive with no hope of recovery, which often entails a loss of quality of life, a loss of dignity, and also the family does not wish to see them suffering like this. Then, and indeed, it is possible to end life in a peaceful way. Now, some religions will declare that to be immoral or sinful, and that's a big debate because we belong to God and our lives are not our own to take. There are a number of religious views from varying religions on this, but from a secular philosophical point of view, I think one could start with Socrates as the model. Socrates committed rational suicide in Athens. His friends, if you read the Crito, and if it's true, then his friends they bribed the guards and they arranged for his escape because they thought he had been unjustly sentenced. And you know that the outcome was that Socrates said it's better to die with honor than live as a fugitive from justice. It was not the laws that were bad, it was the men who were corrupt, and he upheld the law. He had an implicit contract with the state. Had Socrates fled to Thebes, we may not be studying him today. I'm not saying that he had to die. I'm saying that he chose to die. It was a rational choice. So that opens a door to at least a dialogue or a discussion on the rationality of death. We're all going to die. Hopefully, we're all going to be reborn too. I ask my students this. I ask them, what's the leading cause of death? And they say, oh, heart disease or, cancer. And I say, no. Leading cause of death is birth. It's 100% fatal. Only question of time. So if we have some say in our death, I think that's probably on balance a good thing. Why not?
Right. Another question. Philosophical problems are always dissolved and not solved because they are not real problems. What if a person is suffering from the real problem? Is there any help to cure a real problem? I am not sure what it means, real problem.
Yes, the clients I'm seeing in philosophical counseling sessions all have real problems. If you're thinking, I think this is really an equivocation, it sounds to me like an equivocation about the meaning of philosophy. If the questioner thinks that philosophy by definition is only an abstract way of thinking about things, then it's not tangible at all in people's lives. And so, of course, philosophy would be useless if it were only a noetic activity, only an exercise of the mind and nothing else. But excuse me, me, in the world today, as in every generation, there are huge philosophical problems that people face. For example, if you look at the United States, we have a question of abortion. Should it be legal or not? And it's a big social issue. We have questions about euthanasia. Should it be legal or not? We have questions about the environment, whether we should be protecting it and to what extent or not. These are all enormous issues which politicians deal with, which scientists deal with, which many stakeholders in society deal with. What happens to the individual when a single citizen says to herself, should I have an abortion? Or when a single citizen says, how can I protect the environment? What is justifiable in terms of activism or not justifiable in terms of activism or political activism? What is justifiable or not on moral grounds? These are no longer issues when people ask these questions. These issues become personal philosophical problems, and they need to be solved by the person. And a very good way to mediate a solution is to discuss them with a philosopher, to gain deeper insight into the implications and justifications of possible choices. We don't tell our clients what to do, but we help them deliberate more thoroughly. And that surely is not an abstract activity.
Right. Another question, what are the changes that have taken place in psychotherapy? And what are the impacts or effects of those changes in philosophical counseling per se?
Well, this is an enormous question, so I'm fortunately I'm able to dodge it because of its enormity. There is a very good work, a colleague of mine named John Greenwood, who's a philosopher of psychology, has written a wonderful tract on the history of psychotherapy. So I think that anyone who wants to look into the development of psychotherapy and the various stages that it's gone through from the point of view of a very well-informed philosopher of psychology who's devoted a lifetime to studying psychotherapy would be well advised to read Professor Greenwood's book on the history of psychotherapy. I'm not an historian of it, so I can only speak to those areas in which I think psychotherapy is distinct from philosophy, where philosophy itself entertains concerns that are perhaps not tailor-made for psychotherapy, and naturally there's some overlap. Of course, psychologists will talk about issues, as I said before, about meaning or value or purpose, and may do so effectively with their clients. But there are always a multiplicity of ways. This is what is called the underdetermination of theory by data. To be technical, and I'll stop there, it's the Duhem-Klein thesis. There is, in principle, a large number of ways, an indefinite number of ways in which we can use theory to explain a given phenomenon. So when someone presents with a problem, a psychiatrist could look at it one way, a psychologist another way, a philosopher another way, a sociologist another way, a lawyer another way. Yes. So which way is the most appropriate way? Well, it's up to the client to explore and actually to conduct an exploration in order to uncover what is going to be most effective for them. Okay, so that's the best answer I can give.
Right. So we have Dr. Rajivan E. He's been also into philosophical counseling. He's here. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Marinoff, for the insightful talk. And my doubt is regarding the scope of philosophical counseling. That's we strictly compartmentalize and say that philosophy counseling is for rational and functional aspects. But I think my doubt is about that strict compartmentalization. Say if you take the case of an existential issue, the symptoms may be as grief or anger or irritation, something like that. So maybe it's apparently the symptoms are emotional in nature. Only when we get into the detail, we'll see that there are rational elements. And an associated issue or doubt is that, is philosophical counseling hopeless about emotional problems? Can we take up philosophically some of the emotional issues? That's what my doubt.
Great question. I was hoping nobody would ask this, but I knew that if we were talking about rationality and functionality, look, it's rational to be emotional also. Yes, of course. We don't ignore or suppress or disregard the emotions. They play a very important part in our lives. Someone asked me once, a journalist said to me, what do you do if a client starts crying in your office, I say, well, I offer them a tissue. I'm in a box of Kleenex. I offer them a tissue. We are emotional beings, and sometimes it's very healthy to express emotion and very unhealthy not to express it. So sure, but philosophy in its core is not dealing with emotions. We may elicit affect, and I know some philosophical counselors who do it really well, and you sound like you do it really well also. They are able to elicit affect to get to reason, and that's absolutely fine. Those who are skilled in working with affect can definitely elicit rationality and functionality through the expression of emotion. Spinoza has a wonderful theory of emotion, and there's a great philosophical counselor in Europe, Anders Linzeth, who is he describes himself as a Spinozist, and he's very comfortable working with affect in order to get to philosophy. I have no problem with this. I just am more in my own way preferring to deal with people who are going to manage their own emotions, over emotional, then it's more difficult to work with them. They also, at the end of the day, I think there is a demarcation. And so I'm agreeing with you, but I'm saying a caveat. If a person at the end of the day cannot accept any responsibility for what they're feeling, if they cannot own their emotions, if they cannot see that they have played some role as an accomplice, if you like, to their own state of mind, then it will be difficult to work philosophically with them. But if they can say, all right, I see where I have allowed myself, not just that I'm angry, but I've allowed myself to be angered, or, I am resentful, but I've allowed myself to become resentful. If they're experiencing a negative emotion, then if they can take some ownership of it, we can definitely work with them philosophically. I see you agree with that, yeah? But I want to say there's no definition of rationality and functionality anyway. We use these terms with some hand waving, but it's very, very difficult to really pin down what we mean by rational and functional at times.
Right. There's a related question by a professor of zoology. He wants to know, Professor Rahul, are you there? If you wish to ask yourself. I think he has left. Okay. He wishes to ask, what are the indicators that indicate that philosophical counseling is the way out?
Oh, the way out. Well, I wouldn't phrase it this way. I'm great that there's a zoologist. I was hoping to ask the zoologist something, but anyway, okay. Let's put it this way. We conduct normally what we call an initial consultation. So the person will come in and we have a dialogue for 50 minutes. And during that initial consultation, the main purpose is to determine whether this client is suitable for the practice of the if a client is talking to me, we're having a dialogue for an hour, I will make an initial determination as to that client's suitability for my practice. If suitable, I tell them so. I think, okay, I think your problem is such that we can work with it and it may be helpful. Or if not, I refer them, yes, for alternative care. So in that sense, doubt could be an indicator that they're very suitable, or belief could be an indicator that they're very suitable. It's not like there's a list or a paint by number list of what people present that tells us. It's really the substance of what they're presenting rather than the way in which they're presenting it that is informative for that scope of practice. Yes. A client could be angry and could be very suitable. A client could be quiet and withdrawn and very suitable. Until we dialogue, we don't know. Is that clear?
Quite much. There's another question for you from Ishwar. Ishwar, are you there? If you wish to ask your question yourself.
Yeah.
Please
yes,
go
yes.
ahead.
Yeah, I can ask. Professor, you just referred to undetermined or inconsistent belief systems. So are ideologies also part of these belief systems? Then my question is, how philosophical counseling would differ from discursive psychology of Michael Billig?
Of whom? Sorry?
Michael Billig, B-I-L-I-G.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know this person's work. So
they are doing discursive psychology, and they are mainly dealing with rhetoric, prejudices, that are part of ideological belief systems.
Well, this is a big issue
And
for
also,
them.
I think Ian Parker is also, if you have heard, Ian Parker is also related with discursive psychology.
Well, thank you very much for bringing this to my attention, Professor. I'm not knowledgeable at all about discursive psychology. I am knowledgeable about ideologies and some of the brainwashing that goes on and some of the ways in which people need to be deprogrammed, actually, if that's what you're alluding to. But I'll give you a quick case study to illustrate what philosophy could do with a conflicting belief, since that was your sort of opening gambit. A colleague of mine had a client who believed in the Celestine prophecy. This was a popular book some decades ago, which basically declared that God has a plan for everybody. And so, you know, whatever happens to you is part of God's plan and all this sort of thing. So in any case, this fellow was mugged one evening. He was walking at night in a not a safe part of town, and he was robbed at knife point. And so he couldn't reconcile this with his ideology, because his belief was not a religion, it was an ideology. His belief was that God had a plan for him, and therefore God had mugged him. In essence, if everything in his life was part of God's plan and he was just mugged, then God must have mugged him. So this is how he connected the dots, right? So this set up definitely a kind of cognitive dissonance. You could go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a priest, or you would get you would be able to have a dialogue with any number of possible interlocutors who would each perhaps help you to explain this according to some background context. What the philosopher did with him was not to disabuse him of his sort of core belief in God's plan. He wasn't trying to deprogram him or anything, but he said, look, do you, once again, back to this question of responsibility, he said, do you think that God allows you some leeway in the choices that you make? And this fellow thought about it. He said, yes, he could be what we call a compatibilist. He could justify that he has some free will, and that could still, his exercise of free will could still be a part of God's plan. He had no problem being a compatibilist. So that was then easy to resolve, because once he acknowledged compatibilism, then the counselor could say, all right, so then perhaps you made an unfortunate choice when you decided to walk, in this part of town at this time of night, knowing that it might be personally unsafe for you. And so it wasn't really God who mugged you. It was your perhaps unfortunate choice of what to do at that time and place. And he was able to accept that. So it was a comfort to him that he could fall back on his own capacity to choose and not blame God for everything. So that was a way in which, in one session, one could kind of resolve this. And he wasn't traumatized. He wasn't diagnosed. Notice, we don't diagnose, we're not trained to. Immediately, a psychologist will probably diagnose him with PTSD, because they need to get paid. I mean, we didn't talk about the economic side, but if you're in a third-party insurance scheme, you can't get, in the US, you cannot get reimbursed for your services unless you make a diagnosis. The insurance companies want a diagnosis, and when you make a diagnosis, that's a tag. That person wears a tag for the rest of their life, that they've been diagnosed with something. I don't think this is the best way to proceed. Much better to dialogue. I hope that partially answers the question anyway.
Proceeding on to the next, before taking up another question, I was also willing to just extend this question that in your presentation also you mentioned that psychologists and people from psychology, they are not trained for dialogue. I mean, this is a revelation for me. Just wanted to give this observation. I mean, they claim to be counselors, and if they do not know to have a dialogue, to establish a dialogue with their client, I think that's a serious trouble. There's a serious problem.
Well, many of them say this to me also, and I've had a number of psychologists as clients for various reasons, and they really enjoy dialogue, and they're usually very good. They're very smart people, and they're very interesting people to talk to. But I think they're so tightly controlled as a profession that there appear to be very strict boundaries that they're not permitted to cross. And, you know, in the strictest sense, in traditional psychoanalysis, which is not psychotherapy, but in traditional psychoanalysis, you don't even see the psychoanalyst. Yes, you're lying on the couch in the Freudian model, and that person's behind you. You never see their face. And they ask you questions, and they don't contribute anything other than occasional interpretations, but you're not dialoguing with them. It's an interrogation of a peculiar kind. And I think that psychologists do heal. I mean, I know that they do, but they do not dialogue in the way that we do. They're more in the pseudo-medical, the diagnostic model, and the treatment model. So I think that patients sometimes get frustrated because they want to talk. They want to have a dialogue. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We have another question by Dr. Pratibha Sharma. Pratibha, would you like to ask your question?
She's muted.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself, Pratibha.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your lucid presentation. My question is pertaining to the qualification of the trainer, of the counselor. Means who states that somebody can be a professional person for training for the counseling? So you have discussed about the qualifications that a client must possess, but who certifies that certain person can actually counsel the clients?
That's
so
an
is there any institute, is there any training or education given to philosophers for dealing with clients?
Yes, of course there is. And I'm going to pull up, I'll share a screen with you, if I may, very briefly, but I'll give you a verbal answer. Look, it's important to know, and I think this is pretty much the standard in most countries that I'm aware of, and the standard is that professions are not created by governments. Professions are recognized by governments when they attain a suitable standing in the society, and that is done in various ways. In the United States, it goes by state. Professions are governed by each state. And in New York State, where I reside, there are 4 necessary conditions for recognition by government. And those 4 conditions are, firstly, a graduate program, an accredited graduate program in a university, which is graduating people trained to practice that profession. Okay, that's number 1. Secondly, there has to be a corpus of scholarly literature, which is foundational and upon which researchers build. Thirdly, there has to be a code of ethics that governs the practice of the profession. And and fourthly, there have to be regular meetings for the dissemination of ongoing learning about the profession and teaching about the profession. So we have built in the United States, as I've said before, I've co-founded with some of our leading pioneers here in the US, the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. That was founded in 1998, 1999. We started accepting members, and we train and certify philosophical practitioners. So, and Bala and his group, Professor Devarakonda, convened a group last April and May, and they were the first core group of Indian philosophers to be certified by us. We're not the only group that trains and certifies, but nowhere in the world is there a recognition by any government of this as a profession yet. So we have satisfied 3 of the 4 necessary criteria, namely, we have a national professional association that certifies, we have a code of ethics, we have scholarly literature, we don't have an accredited graduate program yet. And I'm embarrassed to say, as an American, I am frightfully embarrassed to say, there is not one university in this whole country of the United States which has yet understood the importance of and the necessity of actually establishing a graduate program for philosophical practice. My own college, which is a storied, the City College of New York is a storied public institution, one of the most famous in the country. Berkeley on the West Coast and CCNY on the East Coast are perhaps 2 of the most storied public institutions. My college has twice approved a master's program in applied philosophy, which would be enough to get us started. Then we later develop a PhD from them. We need the master's to start. Twice they've approved it unanimously last time. But the Central University Administration put it to sleep. You know, we call it administratively induced coma. They didn't want to tackle it. Our higher education system outside of STEM in the humanities is in complete disarray. The humanities are being defunded. Politicians, by and large, no longer understand the importance of humanities. Philosophy is being marginalized in the US. It always has been, I think. And so we're in a time which does not favor the emergence of such a thing. Nonetheless, it's more important than ever because our students in the US are receiving political indoctrination instead of liberal arts education. It's really quite horrifying. So we need this more than ever. Now they've established programs in Spain, in Italy, in Austria, in all over the place. There are many countries where programs in philosophical practice are springing up. And will be successful because society needs this. So I'm sort of mortified to tell you that we don't have this yet, but we are working toward it. You know, we're constantly working toward it. Sooner or later it will happen. So who's going to train them? And this is the key point, right? That governments don't create professions. When you emerge as a corpus of professionals who can render conspicuously beneficial service to society, and you meet these criteria, then there's political action. And then if you have a sponsor in the government may pass legislation saying, all right, we recognize you as a profession. And then, of course, you become eligible for licensing. You become eligible for third-party reimbursement of your services. And it opens a door which enables you to attain parity with many other professions which have already achieved that. We don't want licenses, by the way. I'm not saying that we don't believe. I mean, this is a consensus. It's a question you'll have to debate in India too. Every country has to debate what form the profession will take. We don't believe that anybody should need a license to be a philosopher or to do philosophy. So we don't want the same power of licensure as doctors, lawyers, psychologists have. We think that philosophers should be recognized in a certain way as practitioners, but not with a license. That would be, we think, a mistake. Okay,
Right.
Does that provide some insight?
Yeah. Just two more questions to and then we'll yeah. One of our students wishes to ask, what do you mean when you say that philosophical texts are not self-interpreting?
What I mean is simply that the history of philosophy is quite largely a history of philosophers debating the meaning of what other philosophers said or wrote. Yes, I mean, if you look at Wittgenstein, or you look at Nietzsche, or you look at Plato, for that matter, I mean, there are huge debates in the scholarly literature and in the classroom about exactly what perhaps certain assertions mean or were intended to mean, and perhaps that meaning or that interpretation changes from one era to another, from one society to another. So philosophy is partly the history of ideas. And history is not self-interpreting either, right? There are many different versions that can be written of a given set of events. It's very selective in a certain way. So if you read a French history of Canada, it doesn't look like the same history as an English history of Canada. You know, the two founding, I'm from Canada, and I know this because I've read French history and I've read English history. These are our two founding nations. And if you read the French version and you read the English version, you're going to get completely different stories, a completely different selection of facts and interpretations about the trajectory of that history. So what I mean is that they don't have one definitive meaning for everybody. That's what I mean by not self-interpreting. Whereas Pythagoras' theorem, by contrast, is definitely everybody who reads Pythagoras' theorem and understands it, I would submit to you, understands it in exactly the same way, independent of their political views, or their religious views, or whatever their cultural orientation is. It's self-interpreting. All right? Philosophy is not.
Yeah. And one last question by Anurima. Are you there? All right.
Yes, I'm.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, I was interested to know that when you were uttering middle way and you were talking of your book, so by middle way, do you hint at any sort of compromise in any sense, or it's just a way of synthesizing of the extremes?
Great question. Great question. I don't think that the middle way is a compromise, neither as Aristotle nor Buddha nor Confucius stated. It's a way which requires courage sometimes to practice. It's a way which requires the exercise of one's own innate virtue. And so it is certainly philosophies of each of these ABCs, which are definitely wrong and definitely right. They're not moral relativists at all, and they're not compromising on certain issues. So doing harm to others is almost always wrong, even though, each of these philosophies can be misinterpreted, I believe, or politically hijacked, to attain other ends. As we consult the philosophers themselves, we do not find justifications for certain kinds of behaviors. So it's not a compromise at all, but nor is it an extreme. It's a way of balancing all of the conflicting elements within the human being in such a way as to point our moral compass toward being our best selves. So when you're at your best, Arina, you're not compromising, but you're being the best version of Arina that you can be, and therefore doing yourself and all others who come in contact with you a great service. And this, I believe, is the middle way. And that's not an easy way. It's also been described, you remember from the Katha Upanishad, as the razor's edge. And I think Buddhists took this away from the Katha Upanishad because sometimes it's very sharp, very narrow, and very hard to walk. Nonetheless, it is, I believe, the best way forward for humanity.
Very true. Very true. Anybody who wishes to say anything to Professor Marinoff?
Can I?
Please, Madam.
Thank you, Lou, for this wonderful talk that you have given us. And it's so nice to listen to you after a gap of 3 months, right? 3-4 months. It's so wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I have 1 or 2 observations and also a question that I would like to pose regarding this resolving and dissolving that resolving and dissolving of the real problem that one of our friends was trying to raise. No, yeah, it's that in fact during the process of philosophical counseling, the individual, the client, may finally dissolve the problem concern with which he or she might be coming to us, and also it also gets resolved in the sense that it is assisted one. No, if a philosophical counselor is assisting the individual, then it becomes a kind of resolution of the problem. So it could be dissolving and it could also be resolving. But what is the real problem is something that is to be really understood in a different way. But Rajivan's point is very interesting, and I was trying to address it from the perspective of what I know, Lou. So basically, when you say the client has to be rational and functional, and yeah, it's obvious that some of the people may come with emotional problems as well. But what is being asked here is the individual has to be rational and functional. The problem can be any sort of thing, okay? And among these problems, only certain set of problems would be addressed by philosophical counselor. That is the point that is being stated here. Lou, I have a question. Like sometime back, 3 months back, I was only a student. During this 3 months, I did some amount of practice as well. So I have certain questions that I would like to pose as a practitioner now. See, we have understood that there are 2 kinds of problems, concerns that the individuals come up with. One is problem solving and the other one is process, right? The client may come with an issue which is to be solved, or the client may come to us with a kind of concern with which he would like to transform himself or change, move forward in the process of living. So in both the cases, only with regard to problem solving, you can make the client independent. But it is very difficult to make the client independent if it is the process. So this is the exact problem that I'm facing with one of my clients. Okay, because I don't know where it is going to end. All the time he comes up with something else, so that it continuing since last 4 months. So I don't know how to make him independent. I don't want to get rid of him, but I don't know how to make him independent.
Right. Okay. Well, Bella, it's always a pleasure to hear from you, and you always bring some new insights. Every time we talk, you always present things in a really interesting light. So thank you for your kind comments on the one hand, and to your problem. Yes, in Plato, not Prozac, for the benefit of the others with us, they I do distinguish between these two kinds of clients, and it's not with respect to the problem. So a problem, what I'm calling a problem, is usually something time delimited. For example, a person has to make a decision within 2 or 3 weeks, and they want to make obviously a better rather than a worse choice. But there's some time limitation imposed, so you know that the sessions will end because the client will make a decision. A process is more like, as you say, a transformation, a life change. Someone may be going through a divorce or a career change or a difficult situation, which is not time delimited in a fixed way. So therefore, it would suggest that the interaction will be more protracted. You're going to have more sessions rather than fewer sessions. And you're looking for a way, you say, to wake up the inner philosopher and help the client to be philosophically self-sufficient. You can't rush that. When you're caught up in a process, the process to a certain extent has to unfold. So it's not like you're controlling the process is controlling you to a certain extent. You're now caught up in the process that the client is going through. It's not like my favorite client is the one who says, okay, I have to make a decision in 2 weeks. I'm relieved because I know they're going to make a decision in 2 weeks, regardless of what we discuss. It makes my job easier, not that I'm not necessarily helpful, but when your client is coming with a bigger set of processes that they have to live through, then don't worry so much about the end point. So my meta advice to you would be just have a meaningful dialogue with the client. And you know, if there's a hurricane and you're caught in the hurricane, you have to ride it out. You have to ride out the storm, right? I mean, you can't make it end sooner than the natural process ends. So if your client's problem is like a hurricane, then you just have to hunker down with your client and have a dialogue, and eventually it will blow over. And I am not aware of any psychiatrist formerly who spoke with people, dialogue, or any psychotherapist who has this kind of answer for you either. They all say, and Irvin Yalom was a good model for this kind of old school dialoguing psychiatrist who rejects the DSM. He loves dialogue. He's very good at it. And he says these things resolve. And it's a great mystery. And if it's a great mystery to psychotherapy, how these things resolve, then it's permissible for it to be a great mystery to us. I think that these things do resolve. That it's actually not the destination, but the journey that's important for the client. And taking that journey will in time lead to a destination. So don't be too worried. It's not that you're scheduling unnecessary sessions. You know, we don't want to do that. We don't want to develop emotional codependencies. The client becomes dependent on the counselor becomes financially dependent or other dependent on the client. That's unhealthy. But in a process, Bala, just let the process go where it takes you.
Yeah, thank you.
Your journey.
Yeah, I also understand that it's because of the COVID-19, the overarching trouble that is haunting everyone in the minds. That's
well, if
existent anxiety.
Yes, but people need to have a companion on this journey. Part of it is the isolation and the uncertainty, and all the conflicting messages we get from different, sectors. So I think a philosopher would be a good companion to have on this journey. And there's also literature that's very helpful. When you watch our general meeting talks on YouTube, Barbara talks about the use of literature as a tool for philosophers. For example, Albert Camus' The Plague. This is literally, a novel, although it's an allegory of the Nazi occupation of Algeria and the town of Oran. It's nonetheless a very graphic novel, which shows from the existentialist perspective people's different responses to a catastrophe such as a pandemic. There are many different responses that people could have. So this is teaching a moral lesson in a very beautiful way. So something you could do with your client to further the journey through the process, if your client likes to read. There's some really interesting literature. So bibliotherapy can also be a help.
I would just wondering with regard to Bala's question of process. I'm no expert on the subject, but I mean, I can think on my commonsensical terms. Is it like, sometimes, not always, can we talk in terms of buying times for that client? Is it like buying time for the client when you're talking of the process? Is it like, sometimes you need to let the client evolve with the time so that, maybe time has, the potency to heal, to reveal the solution?
I believe so, and I think that you will also get this from other helping modalities, that time does make a difference. Time is a healer in a way, not only a destroyer. When Shiva is time, it's the destroyer, but there's a healing aspect to time, and that but on the journey through time, the client wants to have a companion. Let me put it to you in a different way that may speak more directly both to Bala and to you. There was a debate in philosophy, which still maybe goes on, but it was a debate about what is primal in human nature. Nietzsche said it's a will to power, for example. Yes. Hobbes thought it was just power itself. Freud thought it was a will to pleasure. So these were all different possibilities that were somehow trying to rank these innate volitions or drives. And I think there's something else that goes on in the human being, and it's not a will to be powerful or a will to be loved or a will to experience pleasure. Rather, it's a will to be understood. It's a passive need rather than an active need. And I think what heals our clients very often, what contributes to the healing process, is this understanding. People sometimes are upset because they don't feel understood. And a philosopher, if we're any good at anything, it should be understanding. And we purport to understand a lot of things, a lot of complex ideas. A lot of things in philosophy are difficult for people because they don't understand them. We're supposed to be reasonably good at understanding. If that's the case, we should also be able to understand our clients. And I think when people feel understood, they also feel better. So the philosopher can be a companion on a journey through a process, Bala, a companion who understands, a companion who shows the client that maybe we can't change the external situation very much, but we can understand. I can understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
So it's empathic, but it's cognitively empathic. It's not just emotional empathy. It's a cognitive empathy that we can give them. And this, I think, is a very powerful thing.
Yeah. Right. Wonderful. Great. Any final comments or observations? Or I think that's so time to thank you formally, Professor Lu. So thank you so much for taking out time on our request. And it was really wonderful. It was really, it was like an eye-opener. And the method that you adopted, I do not know how and why, but it became dialogical, which was, most fascinating thing of this presentation was that you addressed all the questions in your own particular way. But yes, I think that has left us impacted with your warmth, with your presence of mind, and all questions that you have addressed, the way you have addressed. I think we are really thankful and hope to have more conversation on this platform, off the platform, maybe sometimes. And I also wish to thank all my participants, those who are on YouTube, those who have joined here on Google Meet, and thankful to my teachers, Professor Geeta Manektala, Professor V.T. Sebastian, my friends, Pratibha, Namita, Dr. Rajivan, Bharatji, and my students, Akshat, Gorika, and Satwant, and many others. Not last, but not the least, Piyush, who has been always there supporting me in executing these lectures. I'm really thankful to him also. And thank you so much once again, Bala. How can I forget you? Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining. Professor Lu really wanted you to be there. So, in fact, we had a meeting in the afternoon with Bala. So, yeah. So he was our external expert. So I did not miss the chance to invite him. And thank you for honoring that invitation. And we'll connect again with a new speaker and a new, I think, a new frame of reference on this Elenchus again. Thank you all. Thank you all. Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.